There's a favorite quote of mine in the book where Margaret Thatcher, after she retires, is being interviewed, and the interviewer says, "What do you think your greatest accomplishment was?" And she thinks for a minute, and she says, "I think my greatest accomplishment was Tony Blair." And Blair adopted far more Thatcherite policies than he needed to.
I'm here today with Robert Kuttner, the co-founder and co-editor of the American Prospect and a professor at Brandeis University. We're here to discuss his new book, Can Democracy Survive Global Capitalism, to be published by Norton shortly. Thanks for joining us, Bob.
Pleasure.
It feels to me like you're on to one big story. It's about the whole fabric of our social system and whether our economics is enhancing our welfare, as we're taught in our models, or whether it's tearing apart the fabric of our society.
I'm trying in this book to connect a number of dots. The basic storyline is as follows. During and after World War II, the entire West had a very unusual social contract because there were counterweights to the power of finance, the power of capital, in the form of democratically elected governments, in the form of labor unions, that made it possible to have this very unusual 30-year period throughout the West. This wasn't just an American story, where the economy grew nicely and it became more equal. And this was not just an accidental product, as some economic historians think, of the rebuilding after the war. This was a deliberate social contract, if you will, that was the result of some fortuitous events. Namely, the Great Depression had discredited both the Republican Party and it had discredited standard economics, the idea that markets are self-regulating. And then after the war, both the corporate right and the libertarian right were very weak. Mm-hmm. And so you had left Catholic parties and social democrats in Europe. You had the Democratic Party in the United States in a more left-wing mood than usual. And so for 30 years, we built and prospered from this unusual form of managed capitalism, or as some have called it, repressed finance, empowered labor. And that was a kind of social contract that was unprecedented either before or since, and it was the result, politically, of this harmonic convergence of forces. Now, this starts unraveling in the 70s, and by the 80s, the usual suspects are back in charge, and they change the rules, and they use globalization to undo this social contract. Important point here. It's not the only brand of globalization. I get very fed up with the framing of this debate as, are you pro-trade or anti-trade? Are you pro-globalization or anti-globalization? At Bretton Woods in 1944, John Maynard Keynes, who knew the importance of a full employment form of managed capitalism at home, deliberately structured the ground rules of the global economy so that international finance would not undercut the ability of nation states to have a prosperous, egalitarian form of capitalism. That also gets shifted into a form of globalization that deliberately undermines these social contracts rather than reinforces them. Last point, what you get a backlash. Of course you get a backlash, because when ordinary people are harmed and their aspirations are destroyed for 30 or 40 years, what happens is not that the workers of the world unite. What happens is you get support for neo-fascism, you get support for the racialization of economic grievance and the demonization of the other. And again, just as the post-war story was systemic, this story is systemic, and the same kinds of nationalistic dictators and false populists who are really in bed with the 1% are gaining influence everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to the 70s, how it starts to come unraveled. Mm-hmm. We've talked about Paul Samuelson warned economists in a paper he called International Trade for Rich Countries, which he delivered at the Chamber of Commerce, the Swedish-American Chamber of Commerce in 1972. Walter Wriston is credited with being the person who changed finance from something you did until 3 o'clock before playing golf to a new, dynamic, creative, innovative profit center within the economy, and now we have what they call financialization. What were the building blocks of stress that led to the resurgence of the usual suspects you described moments ago?
It's very interesting. Some of this was random and some of it was deeply systemic, because in a capitalist economy, it is anomalous to have the kind of repression of the power of capital that we had during the post-war boom. It took strong unions. It took the war, giving unusual powers to the state. It took this very unusual period where real interest rates were negative during the 50s and 60s, which meant that the rentier class, the asset-owning class, didn't do so well, and everybody else did very well because the rest of the economy had very cheap capital costs. So it's anomalous to expect that a capitalist economy would continue, even though this is very good for everybody else and did not deter innovation or entrepreneurship or economic growth. So in the 70s, you have this convergence of events. First of all, Bretton Woods collapses. And Bretton Woods, to some extent, was an anomaly because, as Robert Kuttner had long warned, the dollar was not capable of being the de facto global currency and being the currency of the United States of America without courting inflation. And then Bretton Woods might have been reformed, but Nixon, because of Watergate, was otherwise engaged and was not the least bit interested in reforming Bretton Woods. And then you had the 1973 war, Israel versus the Arabs. And so while Nixon is preoccupied with Watergate and Bretton Woods is collapsing, the dollar price of oil goes down because the dollar has been devalued, and the Arabs are very annoyed at the West. And so they see a moment in which OPEC can raise oil prices without being invaded because everybody else is otherwise engaged.
Yeah.
And they get away with it.
Yep.
And the price of oil is quadrupled. And then that cycles through the economy in the form of higher prices.
And we'd come out of the Lyndon Johnson led guns and butter after the race riots
With some inflation,
in Vietnam.
Yep.
So there was pressure, upward pressure on wages, some inflation, and a compression of profits. And then what you might call the straw that broke the camel's back was the compression related to energy price squeeze on profits.
Yes. So you have a very turbulent, unstable economy, and you have the beginning of this anomalous stagflation where you have both inflation and stagnation at the same time. And you have a weak president in Jimmy Carter. And so all of this serves to discredit the so-called Keynesian management of the economy. They really weren't Keynesians. They were centrists. But the right, in economics, Milton Friedman and company, in politics, Ronald Reagan and company, even though the 30s had completely discredited the idea that markets are self-correcting or self-regulating, this old idea gets another turn. And so it gets resurrected at the level of ideology and professional economics, and it gets back in the saddle at the level of politics, of course, first with Thatcher and then with Reagan. And then when these people get into power, they double down on destroying the social contract of the mixed economy.
Well, this Lewis Powell memo that was written
Yes.
to the Chamber of Commerce before he became a Supreme Court justice, I think late in the Nixon term, almost paints the picture of where they're going to go vis-a-vis universities, vis-a-vis government, vis-a-vis the media, to market a restoration of the strength of corporate power and the importance of markets and the importance of finance.
Well, and as you know better than I do, and the last word that you said I think deserves to be italicized here, it's finance.
Yes.
It's not just corporation. It's financial capital, it's Wall Street, it's the city, it's banking. And so, banking in the 30s and 40s had almost become a public utility. It was very, very, very tightly constrained in terms of what banks could do. One set of regulations for commercial banks, one for investment banks. And I think it was Simon Johnson who pointed out that right after the war, the financial sector is maybe 12 or 13% of all corporate profits, and on the eve of the collapse, it's 46%. So that's not because the financial sector is contributing that much benefit to the rest of the economy. Rather, it's a leech on the rest of the economy. But all of that economic power translates into political power, and you get a self-reinforcing cycle. The more political power they get, the more they change the rules to their own benefit.
In your book, you have a chapter on the decline of the center left.
I actually call it the disgrace.
The disgrace, that's right.
And this is Schroeder, Clinton, and Blair, who were buddies, who had the same analysis of what center-left parties had to do. Namely, they had to become more like center-right parties. And so when the collapse comes, you say, well, where's the opposition party? There is no opposition party, because the things that led to the collapse, whose fingerprints were on them? Well, Clinton, Schroeder, and Blair. They were co-conspirators in the deregulation and ultra-financialization that had led to the collapse. So when people start looking for a champion, where do they look? Well, they look to Syriza in Greece, except the rules are so rigged that even when a radical party gets elected, the radical party is forced to be brought to heel because the austerity party has so much power.
Do you see the pressures on the center-left parties related to the rise of money politics, that they felt like they had to build bigger and bigger war chests in order to play in the mass media and be suitable for election? Or do you think it's the changing balance of the structure of interests? You mentioned the rise of finance. What's driving them to their disgrace?
Well, it's both. And of course, Schroeder, Clinton, and Blair have all become wealthy men. They didn't have to become wealthy men. I mean, Jimmy Carter did not become a wealthy man. And so some of it, I think, is venality and corruption. Some of it is a feeling that, yeah, we got to get in bed with Wall Street to be financially competitive. But Bill Clinton did not have to give Robert Rubin the power that he gave Robert Rubin. I mean, I wrote a piece on Rubin in 2007 called Fatal Attraction, about the Democratic Party and Robert Rubin. And in researching that piece, I went and I read every major piece that had ever been written on Bob Rubin. This was the first unfavorable feature piece that had ever been written on Bob Rubin. Rubin had the press eating out of his hand, and there was that famous cover of Time magazine, the Committee to Save the World.
Right. Greenspan and Larry Summers, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So these people, did they save the world? No, they cost the world $20 trillion of GDP when their policies brought about the financial collapse. So I guess in the book, I try to link this story of how the social compact that used to serve ordinary people was done in, and then how that led to the rise of neo-fascism and what we might do about it.
People have often said that capitalism gets its moral authority from being governed by democracy. But as the democracy, how would I say, is increasingly exhibiting despair because the economic system has not been responsive, it becomes extreme. It elects people like the people you're talking about around Europe, like Donald Trump. And I think there's a great danger here that we may lose faith in democracy as the corrective mechanism.
Well, no question about that. And what I argue in the book is that democracy is being pummeled from two sides. First, as corporate capital, financial capital, increasingly makes the rules, the compass of democracy to govern, especially to govern the economy, is being narrowed. So you have trade deals that say, we're going to have a clause that allows you, as part of a trade deal, to argue that ordinary health, safety, environment, labor regulation violate my right to do free trade under NAFTA, or violate my right to do free trade under TTIP or whatever. This is investor-state dispute resolution. It's removing from the province of democratic governance to a kangaroo court all kinds of issues involving the governance of capitalism. So from one side, and Danny Roderick, I think, is the great spokesman for this viewpoint, professor at Harvard. From one side, the takeover of the rules by the 1% is narrowing the ability of government to govern capitalism. From the other side, the reaction to that on the part of ordinary people is calling into question whether we even care about democracy itself. So you can see the domain of democratic government being shrunken and shrunken and shrunken. And we got to take that back.